a way, I think it is the central call and invitation of all of these conversations, at least that I've been having, is to be like, look, you are alive.
Mm-hmm.
This is your chance. What you do matters. Participate in your life, participate in the world. Like that is it,
That
right?
is
Because
it.
there's so much of our system that is hell bent on making us forget that we are participants. They want us to think that we're consumers or
Mm,
voters or something else. We are
mm.
participants here on this world, and we can make a sacred world, or we can live in a flat world, or we can live in a materialist world. We get to participate in that in any case.
Hello and welcome to the next episode of Voice Club. My name is Tim Adalin and this is a conversation with Daniel Thorson. Daniel is the host of the Emerge podcast, which has become a really, really pivotal podcast, I think, for collating a whole range of really interesting thinkers. It tracks the themes of civilizational collapse and what we can do about that from the point of civilization design. But importantly, it also brings that element of personal transformation, how we can transform ourselves and in so doing transform the world. It's not looking at it from an either-or perspective. It's very much from a mode of we are deeply involved in the world, and how we develop ourselves is also inherently related to the systems we interact with, and also, therefore, how we can make the world. I'm not making that point particularly well there. That's not what this introduction is about. Suffice to say, that's a way of thinking that also resonates strongly with this project and ultimately with the philosophical outlook that underlies some of our exploration here and also many of the conversations in this project. Now, there are two parts to this conversation. And the first part is mostly an outside-in look at what Daniel's taken to emerge so far on his podcast Inquiry, which I think is really interesting. But the second part is, to me, even more interesting. It certainly felt that way to engage in. It's much closer to the core impulse of this project, which is to really engage in transformative conversations, perhaps those from an inside-out perspective, really feeling your way into a philosophical exploration. We talk about omni-win and how to understand it, whether or not it should in fact be understood as an omni-growth way of conceptualizing systems, interaction. When is it appropriate to lose? Is it a good thing to lose? We also talk about soul-making and the deep importance of participation. But most of all, it's a dialogue that flowed, and one that, I hope you find interesting, and I hope actually that it can be inspirational to some of you who are looking to involve yourself more in the world, but from a perspective where you can do so really grounded in yourself. And there's a lot to say there. But in a certain mode of listening and in a certain mode of expression, in relationship, self seems to reveals itself other ways too, but can be a beautiful thing. And yes, so Daniel introduces himself shortly. He lives in a monastery. It's called the Monastic Academy. It's based in Vermont. And fundamentally, the Monastic Academy, as Daniel describes it, is, as they describe their own mission, is for the preservation of life on Earth, which is an exceptionally heavy load, and seems to me necessary. But it's a big thing to sit with. So, yeah, I will see you very shortly. Whether you're watching on YouTube or listening as a podcast, remember to subscribe and hit the bell to track upcoming releases. Much love. All right, Daniel Thorson, thank you so much for being here and entering into this conversation with me.
Yeah, pleasure to speak with you. I've really enjoyed our conversations.
Yeah. I have been following your work for, I think, possibly around about a year,
Oh,
give or take a few months. I think all of a sudden things start to blur a little bit when it comes to tracking so many of the elements within some sort of subculture that I think we share a mutual interest in. Certainly, you are, to me, a really key player in bringing together really interesting voices and adding to the discussion in a meaningful way. And what I'm hoping today to talk about is what you see that discussion as, like how you've seen it emerge. Of course, your podcast is called Emerge. And so perhaps, if you could take a few moments just to introduce yourself briefly and then also talk about what you're doing. And then we can go into perhaps what you see emerging.
yeah. Okay, sure. So yeah, I guess the short kind of current bio is, as you said, I host a podcast called Emerge. It's been going on for about 2.5 years or so, although I took a little break in there somewhere. And I also live at a place called the Monastic Academy, where I train full time in a kind of monastically inspired training center where we spend a lot of time in silent meditation. We do a practice called circling. We do trauma healing. We do like peer coaching. And here I'm doing that training. And then I'm also helping design a new curriculum, attempting to kind of ground some of the ideas I've been exploring on my podcast into an educational context. Try
Mm,
to train people for the kind of world that I think both you and I sort of hope is coming, see coming, want to help nudge into being.
right.
That's kind of the short bio. And then the the podcast, man, it's hard to say what it is. I think I started it because there were certain conversations that I wanted to hear. I've always listened to podcasts for like much of my adult life. It's been a major way that I've learned, and I kept waiting for certain conversations. That eventually I was like, oh, maybe I can have them. Maybe I'm the one to have them. And so I started having them, and really it was the reason I chose the word emerge as the title was because I wanted a brand that was broad enough to include anything that I was interested in. Because
Mm-hmm.
I had seen a friend of mine become almost like victimized by his brand because he used it to explore something that he's really passionate about at the time, but then kind of fell out of love with.
Right.
And it was really difficult for him. And so I basically used it as an excuse to just talk to people about what I was interested in and just kept following that thread. And so I've had lots of really interesting conversations around a diversity of topics, many of which I think you're exploring on your podcast as well, and have found my way into this weird little subculture that, yeah, as you acknowledged, like we both kind of find ourselves in as it
Yeah.
begins to form. Yeah.
Yeah. I can certainly relate to wanting to have a broad enough scope so that you can be free to follow what's relevant as it comes up. What struck me then as you were talking actually is, yes, what's emerging is so interesting and that gives you the scope, but a key thing that you often discuss is sort of what occurs before emergence often, and that's sort of decomposition.
True.
And so it's got that part to it too. How would you describe the environment, or what sort of conversation were you looking for that just wasn't occurring?
Hmm. Yeah, I don't know that I could articulate it originally. Really, it was following a felt sense, some kind of desire, some kind of like eros in relationship
Right.
to certain types of conversation. Um, and as you say, like when I described, there were some college students here for a retreat this last weekend, and I was asked in front of them like to describe what my podcast is about. And I don't know where they're all from. They're college students,
Right.
what their kind of ideological commitments are, whatever. And I just said the podcast, the kind of thesis of the podcast is something like, or inquiry of the podcast is something like, uh, the world is falling apart. What are we going to do?
Yeah.
And that's really kind of it, right? That's sort of the idea, is that there is this disintegration, this falling apart, the senescence of so many of the aspects of the world that I think for a long time we've taken for granted. Or I mean, not a long time, cosmically, but in recent history. And that is both needs to be acknowledged, right? We need to acknowledge that dissolution, but also see that, as you say, it clears a space for something new to emerge, and kind of trying to sort of sniff out the pheromones of that emergence as it's occurring live on this planet right now.
Yeah.
Partly as a hope to just to see it, but then also
Right.
perhaps to kind of facilitate its unfolding.
Right. At least to be in touch with it so that you can orient in a way that is authentic and for some in the direction of love.
Right. And that's true too, right? It's a little bit like I say, like I'm following what's emerging, but also like what's emerging is like the alt-right and the rise of authoritarian governments, but I'm not really covering that. I'm not trying to focus on that. I have some kind of moral commitment that colors and isolates, constrains my inquiry, as you say, and it has to do with wanting to build a future that we can actually be proud to live in.
Yeah. Yeah. How what are the key themes? What are the elements of conversation that either surprised you that emerged, or that were in fact they sort of felt congruent with that initial felt sense of inquiry and have now become sort of really not concrete, but close to concrete pillars of how you describe the pheromones, as you said, of what is substantial to use as a basis for inquiry.
Yeah. So I like the way you put that. Yeah, it's nothing that I didn't feel was there at the beginning, but they've all kind of filled out, right? And so there's
Yeah.
things like uh, decentralized governance, like whether it's distributed autonomous organizations or even things like in spiral or holacracy, and
Mm.
sort of the emerging technology that might allow those to scale. There's systems science, complexity science, and in particular, the ability to kind of see things in terms of flows that move in different ways, are constrained by different factors. One thing that actually has kind of surprised me is, for me, the inquiry around the importance of soul and soulfulness and soul making. That
Mm.
wasn't really on my radar before. That, of course, like the kind of relevance and significance of personal development and personal transformation in terms of how we can collectively meet the meta crisis. And then, different flavors of the meaning crisis, as John Vervaeke talks about it. I've kind of broached that in a number of different ways.
Right.
And then another theme is, of course, like kind of a letting go of the world that we've grown up with, and the stories and like kind of narratives about what our lives ought to be, that civilizational operating system gave to us, which has been
Yeah.
for me very painful and like a long process.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there are others, but that's just kind of like some off
Yeah.
the top of my head. I mean, we've also explored metamodernism and
Yeah.
kind of like integral and all that kind of
Yeah.
fun, weird stuff. Yeah.
It's interesting the different communities, different memes
Hmm.
that are clustered around whatever that broad area of inquiry is that you just articulated. If I was to put it into slightly other words, and I'm sure I'm leaving out crucial parts of it, but it's something like, how do we put together, synthesize, or relate in a congruent,
Hmm.
fluid way the inner development and expression of individuality in a landscape of interconnection where we ourselves are complex agents having an effect on a complex, multi-layered world. So and the meaning associated with what it is to express our authentic unfolding and evolution in that larger dynamic that itself is changing. And so there's something quite meta about that. And so there is this meta element that I think sort of ties together a lot of these different communities, whether, you know, the metamodernists, which I'm not too familiar with, although I've tried to track it a bit, or of course you have, you know, those awesome co-founders of the Neurohacker Collective, just trailblazing what they're doing, providing meta map after meta map. And Jordan Peterson actually as well he was you know, his intellectual scaffolding was a meta theory of meaning, and of course the integral theorists the same. And so there is this sense in which, you know, putting a sort of trying to find some fertile center ground is in some sense not on the same plane, but raised something that is able to offer a perspective that is perhaps beyond dichotomies that are tired and not serving us. And that move towards transcending and including, then obviously with the famous integral phrase, is a sort of basic scaffolding for transformation in general. So there is somewhere that I think would be interesting for us to try and explore together, and I want to see if I can set the stage for it. I hope I can express the idea well enough. So the idea, I mean, I might begin by saying, like, we're embedded in an interrelation of complex systems, and some change quicker than others. You know, obviously our cells have a shorter lifespan than neurons, and we live for so long, cities last for so long, generally speaking, governments, civilizations, the solar system, species. And there's a sense in which what is meaningful is to engage in a certain kind of loving transformation towards some sort of, how we say, stability, but also expression over time, some sort of fulfillment, some sort of whole making of one's own individual self in relationship to others, all the time while elements of yourself and the world around you are moving at various cycles towards decay. And it's perhaps a task, especially in the world that we wake up to right now, which is one where we have the capacity, at least to some degree, to reflect and to engage in abstraction and to watch this crazy dynamic of witnessing and being with and participating and then being disconnected so that we can, in some sense, take a perspective. And that's something really worth talking about. But the idea might be, an interesting avenue for exploration is, at what level or which problems or which underlying systemic changes or which aspects of ourself are most in need of tending and shepherding a certain transformation as their time is right, rather than before their time. Some things might serve us still for longer. There might be social aspects of our society now that we might come to see in a few hundred years' time are, you know, not serving us then, but right now perhaps we're unaware of them, or perhaps that's not the right place for someone's focus. We've noticed obviously the development of a certain morality over time, and it seems inappropriate to look back at ancestors and just tar them all with a brush of being absolutely immoral. There was a sense in which everyone was responding to the dynamics of the time and the incentives of the time with the capacity they had, and so it becomes then crucial to consider just what of our nature is most in need of change. And where I see this question being relevant is when it comes to the kind of conversation and the kind of points that, let's say, Daniel Schmachtenberger raises, and that have become key parts of the emerging conversation, which is to do, I suppose, with rivalrous dynamics and a certain win-lose attitude towards how we show up in the world in relationship with others. And that is deep. It's so deep, and I'm not sure how deep. I actually don't know how deep. It might be so deep that is all there is. It gets so deep where I'm like, okay, how, at what level is this picked apart? Where do we go to find ourselves in that? And so, I began by saying with this question, I hope I can pose it properly. I don't have a full articulated question. I've tried to give a context of some things changing quickly and some things changing slowly, and to be a sort of as elegant as possible about changing things. But we're at this point where things need to change in huge ways because consequences are so drastic. So I wonder what comes up for you there in terms of perhaps where you found some of the most fundamental underlying, the sort of the deep code, the deep programs that you feel are worthy to draw up into articulation as those that we ought take seriously from a point of real transformation.
Hmm. Hmm. It's a beautiful question. I think one of the pieces of what you said that was most striking was kind of this question of what if it's rivalrous dynamics all the way down? And that's a really significant question, and a lot actually hinges on that question. And I think we can kind of put a bookmark in it, but just to say, like, the perspective of, in my opinion, like the Buddha Dharma and certainly the teacher here at the monastery, is that in fact there is, we might say, like an omni-win foundation to consciousness that is kind of waiting to be overturned underneath the rivalrous. At least that's how kind of I understand it. Yeah. And so that's important to at least imagine that might be true for any of this to actually work out in the long run. In terms of like what needs to be transformed, I mean, it's, as you say, it's so hard to point to anything in particular. And I think that is why, like, Jordan and Daniel really emphasize this capacity for sovereignty and choice making, right? Because if you try to learn or unlearn anything in particular, it's connected to everything else because everything is connected. And so you just don't know kind of what you're doing. And that's kind of how we got in the mess we're in, right? Like, we didn't know when we made cars to solve the horseshit problem in cities and go faster that it would lead to war in the Middle East and climate change. And so, like, we also have to, what we can do though is take a look at, if we can find it, that which, when increased or when worked on, like allows us to then respond skillfully in whatever circumstances we find ourselves in, knowing that we don't know and everything is changing so quickly. Because that's certainly for me, like, what I really try to like focus on is increasing my sovereignty, focusing on those capacities of choice making.
Mm. Mm.
But I don't really feel satisfied with that answer, given the kind of quality that I felt with your question. Yeah.
What comes to mind for me is that the question I asked is perhaps not the sort of question that the feeling of so total satisfaction in answering it would be appropriate, right?
Mm.
Because it's precisely the kind of question that collective intelligence, let's hope, is capable of addressing in an ongoing fashion. It's so challenging because letting go of things is so difficult.
Yeah, well, and that's the other thing that comes to mind is if you're gonna work on one thing, I would say come to terms with your own death.
Mm-hmm.
Accept that you will die.
Mm.
That not only will that prepare you to be of service, but I think to the degree that we can make that movement of accepting our own death, we can actually engage with this situation we find ourselves in with our like whole soul and our whole heart online.
Yeah.
Like I was talking to Zach Stein. I was recording an episode with him yesterday, and he said that you know one way to look at this is that we can put the soul as the basis, as the primary thing, and then in that case, we might imagine that it would be worse to lose your soul in the act of saving the organic world than it would be to let it pass and save your soul and nourish your soul, protect your soul. Obviously, that's like a kind of like extreme position, and it's not like actually, but just to kind of emphasize a point, right? And so like that's something that I feel a lot too is in this whole world, this milieu, it's like, oh, we got to like organize to save the planet from collapse. And it's like, well, like, how are you treating your loved ones, right? Like, what are your conversations and relationships like? Like, what's the health of your soul,
Mm.
right? Like, how is it? How is it? Like, as he said in the conversation, like, that's the real game. Like, game A, game B, like, yes, please. We need that. But also, like, don't forget, you know?
Yeah. Something that I've found to be an expression, one of the expressions of a bedrock place I've found myself is the expression, I will not violate my soul. And that's non-negotiable.
Yeah, I can detect that in being with you. It's actually a really like beautiful quality that you have.
Mm. And the link I see between what that expression means, or at least part of what it means, and conversation is there's a straight link there up into the courage to step out and express what seems resonant.
Yes. Yeah.
And that seems to be one key piece of wisdom throughout the ages that underlies, I think, many of the salient figures and speakers and teachers of our time. It's, and it accords with this fundamental truth of the unique quality and importance of every individual voice. Expression, it doesn't have to be verbal, of course, but that there is a role, that there is a line of melody, that there is a part of the dance to participate in.
Mm.
And if that is brought forth, its change is, well, I don't know what its change is, but it is involved.
Yes. Yeah. Yes.
So there's something I want to track back to and draw up here, and it relates back to this interplay of rivalrous dynamics, and at what layer of the psyche, a collective psyche, perhaps biological substrate that they're embedded in, that it's embedded in. And it's funny, on this side of the conversation where I'm experiencing myself for this moment as putting the question forward, it seems in so doing, I am carving the world in such a way that is, somewhat oppositional, that there is this tension here, and it's kind of breaking things up so that then perhaps we can move towards a witnessing or observing, and then that process becomes a cycle that we can situate ourselves in as one, and therefore that dualness, that duality, perhaps becomes as one. And it's interesting, that question a dynamic, and the reason I say it is because actually I'm, in some deeper sense that I can't express in the asking of the question, I believe and know that at core, due to the interconnected nature of things, that there is inherently a equal parts beautiful and tragic, but ultimately a dynamic that is transcendent of any, like a sort of a final win-lose formulation. However, situating ourselves in relationship with that nature that is there to be with at times, but I know for my part I fall out of all the time. And then our actions in this plane at this time, given the complexity of them, given our immense power, all of a sudden there we're back open again to this vast complexity. But what I have to say, and what I hope I can now move myself along to putting forward, is that the win-lose dynamic, as opposed to the omni-win, if that's characterized, and so I suppose first, tell me if this is a characterization you share. If this omni-win dynamic is perhaps instead a sort of an omni-growth dynamic, then the idea of losing is perfectly acceptable, insofar as that affords growth and continued participation in a unifying feature that is respected and loved as a cycle of that loving participation. For example, so I'm a big football fan, soccer for you guys. I support Tottenham, the fucking best team in the world. and this is a domain in which I'm more than happy to be motherfucking rivalrous, okay?
Right.
And there's always that joke there. And of course, it's not always that joke for some people. And then we can use that as a lens by which to understand, some people's difficulty in life fundamentally. But there's something still valuable about losing. And there's referees, and it's like, okay, we agree that there can only be one winner, but in the striving for that, there is a beautiful journey created, and we shake hands at the end. And in some sense, there's a deeper nature to the game that is, there's a beauty to it that is the true joy for me, and I think is the true joy that underlies it. So I suppose I'm asking you, how do you understand the omni-win dynamic, and when is it appropriate to lose in some sense, or what kind of losses are important?
Yeah, I love that inquiry. So for me, I think of omni-win as this kind of like infinite game attractor that we will almost certainly like never realize, right? But it's useful insofar as it helps us engage with the world such that we start to see opportunities for transformation. And also get a kind of felt sense of like, oh, this is the world that we want to create together. It's totally reasonable to me that there could be like losing what looks like losing in the context of a grander winning, a richer winning, right? That makes a lot of sense to me. And I think this is something that was said in the new, I think it's called the Nordic Ideology, the second book in the Listening Society trilogy, where they say like really another way to understand it is like we want to make the losing less bad, right? And so there might still be like winners and losers. Like that seems like reasonable, at least for many years into the future. But like that losing would turn you into a social pariah where you're just put into basically a hell realm on earth due to circumstances of birth or whatever, all the ways in which our current system basically casts you out, exiles you from the kind of benefits of being a human, right? There's something in that, like we want to make the losing less bad, but then yeah, totally, like I mean, even like I can imagine in like a sports context, like there's this something I want to climb, and I try to climb it and I lose over and over again, and that's part of the journey of winning, right? And so there is clearly like developmentally this sort of movement of challenge and failure and failure and failure, and then like rising to the occasion. And like certainly like here at the monastery, which I often think about as a kind of like microcosm omni-win system, right? All of us are here for the sake of our growth. There's a lot of like losing going on in the sense that you get told like you did that wrong. You did not do that well enough. You lost. You had a goal and you did not achieve it. And in a way that's a kind of losing, but it's in service of a bigger winning and a context that we can all kind of trust in, believe in, feel a part of, which I don't think can in any way, shape, or form be said about the losing that goes on in our operating system collectively right now. So yeah, I mean that's kind of what comes up for me.
Yeah, no, I think that all makes a lot of sense. When losing does not afford or is not consistent with growing and participating in the growth and wholeness and whole making of the collective, then to me that seems like a decent first crack at a definition of the badness of losing that does not serve anyone and that we do not want to see.
Yeah. And just to make it less vicious. It's so vicious in the world today. It's so vicious.
It's so easy as well. And look, and I can only speak to this from some blinkered perspective. What I have witnessed in my own life is just how difficult it is to make productive movements towards betterment in any form when your key, physiology is fucked. When your nervous system is not in a good state, and these baseline conditions, it does seem to be the case that people forget, or perhaps never have experienced, but then forget just what it is to be in a state of less capability. And this was something perhaps I did not understand as well as I do now. I don't think I was majorly blind about it, but we take a certain, we have like a minimum viable product as a big organ. And if some of those conditions aren't met, then it's very, very difficult to move the needle in other places. And
Totally.
yeah, this is an example of the yeah.
Yeah, I think I agree so wholeheartedly. I think it's, I've been in states of crippling, like near suicidal depression before, right? Which has given me a kind of, I think, a sense of what it can be like to just have, we might say, like a very reduced sovereignty,
Right.
feeling of like very little freedom, very little capacity to meet the world as it is.
Right.
And it's like, at least in America, like maybe most people, maybe more than most people, are like locked in a state of stress response
Mm-hmm.
that is compromising their capacity as an organism to actually do like coherent sense making, to really like make good choices. Like, and it's like, yeah, that's the state of our world, like in which losing puts you in a position where you're subject to negative feedback loops that
Mm-hmm.
make you harder and harder and harder. It's a downward spiral of poverty. And certainly here in America, it's a very real phenomenon, and it's terrifying. So what it means to
Mm-hmm.
like not lose so bad would mean that somehow we break that spiral, we create a floor that people can't lose past. It's just like if when I say it, it feels so obvious, but it's also clearly hasn't been done, and so it's radical in a way, you know.
Sure, sure. And well, and of course, we could talk about incentives that people, are in an environment with that might affect them to recognize this less. And it's also a capacity of awareness to attend to what about your structure, the different elements of it are or are not in a position where you yourself are able to act with more sovereignty. So I suppose it takes sovereignty to recognize a lack of it as well. So that we have always these both sides. And there was something that came up when you were speaking there, which ties in with some of the memes that I think John Vervaeke, amongst others, is most like the right figure to point to in this emerging conversation, things he's introduced. And a lot of the terms he's introduced, of course, are from other researchers, and he's kind of collating them. And so my apologies for not being educated enough to speak to the appropriate, people who have introduced these terms. But you mentioned negative feedback loops, and this is a key thing to realize that we can get stuck in. And this is, a good first approximation of addiction.
Mm-hmm.
John refers to it as a reciprocal narrowing of the capacity to attend.
I love that framing.
Yeah, it's really, really nice. Whereas self-transcendence being a reciprocal opening. So as this sense, and there's, the notion of sovereignty is, of course, playing a role in there, is this capacity, again, to look out, observe, sense make, act, observe again, discern, of course. So if we're looking then at what is some kind of unifying feature of society, the collective, which enables good losing to contribute, then, I mean, it just struck me that that in itself, a crucial characterization of that unifying feature needs itself to be open to its own reciprocal opening, its own transcendence. So what in fact we participate in itself is itself open to the same kind of transformation, which all of a sudden then, but and that concept is something I've been thinking about for a long time. And it's not an easy concept, I think, to grasp. Although I'm really terrible at telling what's easy or not easy to grasp. I'm hopeless, actually. I'm hopeless at that. And that's a major error of mine. It's almost selfish. It's like once I understand something, I don't understand how I understand it. And then I forget how I didn't understand it before.
That's actually a particular kind of bias. I think it's like called the expert's bias or something like that. It's like a
Right.
certain kind of cognitive fallacy. I only learned about it recently. It's fascinating because I have that same.
Right. I actually don't know how to address that apart from in dialogue with someone, then, and you can attend to what's
itself. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
But as far as disseminating a message without being in touch with the people,
yeah,
clearly I have not a good grasp on this. So yeah, I feel that.
Well, also one thing I want to say is I feel very strongly, like philosophically, totally aligned and resonant with what I hear you expressing, right? That like, and there's this beautiful book called Networkologies, which is a philosophy of networks. It's not like network science. It's actually more like kind of like Deleuzian philosophy applied to networks.
Mhm.
And what it posits as the very central function of the kind of networks that are, I mean, to put it loosely, like the networks that are going to save the world, right? Create a context of robust emergence, right? Robust emergence means emergence, but the emergence that we trust to go on and continue, right? And just that's such a simple frame, right? But what we have right now in our culture, in our world, is emergence that is not robust, that is actually going to decline and is in senescence. And so what does it mean to create robust emergence? Emergence that actually begets itself in an autopoietic way over and over again, creating new novelty, new opportunities for growth, new understandings of what growth even is, because we probably don't even know what it is. Human beings have not found the furthest reaches of what a human being can be. You know, look at what we have to overcome if we're educated in most of the, you know, public education system. You have to like first uninstall that before we can even get to baseline of like and so it's like, yeah, I think I really vibe with that sort of flavor and aesthetic of like what we're actually going for is that like endless like creation, newness, like emergence, pouring forth of the human soul back into itself in order to reflect back out into the world in this kind of like, yeah, infinite process of soul making, collective soul making. That's what it points to for me. And yeah, there's something I love about that.
It's hard to see. It's hard to see another. It's hard to. I don't know the right. It's hard to be motivated by anything else. I would add another piece to it, which is that if we understand that the unfolding and evolving and that, you know, continual making as a certain kind of growth, and there's a soil, there's a ground in which that growth is embedded and is nourished from, and this gets back to this idea of some things changing slowly and some things changing quickly. So it's the mechanisms we have, in fact, to analyze. Although it's not just analysis that's doing it, there's still this capacity to discern in this other way that's oriented by this feeling tone, or how we want to say it. But it's really what are the plate tectonics that are supporting us now, and what are the dead roots that need to change? Always that recursive, self-reflective criticality. And so we are across the past and the future, right? Like we are attendant to what is relevant in all of it somehow. So it's obviously not just an expansion out without attachment and love for its roots. And it's what in our roots is like, what are we when we take away, or when we act from what do we reduce humanity down to? Like before, like what is there in our nature? Like I know I'm losing it here, but it's this dynamic between connection and disconnection. Like what are we disconnected from? And what do we find when we connect back to that? And how ubiquitous is that source of connection? Or at what point?
Yeah, well, what's coming up for me as I hear you speak is there's a kind of sense of you know, this kind of oscillatory or both and nature of going back and retrieving, and in some cases protecting that which has brought us to this point, while also forward looking, kind of preparing to move into totally different unknown futures. And that like there's I really appreciate that like one of the proposed icons of the metamodern movement is Janus, the two-faced god, right? Who's looking back into the past and also forward into the future, and kind of being there in the present.
Mm,
acknowledging the value in both directions and not like leaning too far forward or too far back. And yeah, it's kind of finding that center where
mm,
you're not. And I think the my own tendency, and I suspect the tendency of this kind of emerging subculture is going to be leaning too far into the future, leaning too far forward, not doing the work it takes to fully understand what you think you're deconstructing and letting go of,
mm,
because it takes a lot of work. Like in the context of the Buddhist tradition, that I'm participating in here, like the amount of thinking and beautiful, sophisticated, elegant, like just mind-blowing thoughtfulness that went into the construction of this tradition, that we then, like Westerners, think we can come in and be like, oh, like I wrote a 100-page book and like this is what Buddhism is about. No need for all of that we thought we needed. Like I got it. This the kind of like audacity of that and the arrogance of that is really striking. And I think that there are, I imagine, because Buddhism is the kind of system that I'm sort of closest with, that's probably true for many, many, many different systems, arenas, domains,
mm,
disciplines that
mm,
we are considering moving beyond or
mm,
considering transcending and including without actually doing the work
mm,
of knowing what it means to include that thing.
mm.
It's very easy for transcending and including to become a kind of way of bypassing and ignoring something without actually getting access to the understanding and wisdom that it's pointing to.
That's very interesting. That's very, very interesting. I keep looking across just to check the time, but no, yeah, what struck me is the importance of dialogue and the importance of immediate participatory feedback with others in an attempt to make sense of things, right? There's something about writing that is a beautiful exercise. I love it. It's extremely important to me. I've published nothing
Mm.
and I've written a lot. I've published nothing. I write to myself. I try to understand things and develop my understanding. And I'm constantly faced with the inadequacy of what I see in front of me to contribute to where I feel actually most resonant to then explore and question. And I'm not trying to make a more general point here exactly, other than, I mean, this is my own experience. But there is something about, there's something attractive about, writing a book and exploring things through and taking people on a journey and having that stuff all down there. But, you know, life is not a closed book.
Mm.
Some things we can, look at and go, okay, this is wrong. But then there's still the participating in and that understanding of what that was. And there's something, I'm so much more, it feels that interaction. That's why I'm so grateful for all the different people doing this out here, in particular people like John Vervaeke, who engage so much with so many people. And this is someone who has done the work to write many books.
Totally.
He has, of
Yeah,
course,
yeah,
written a bunch
yeah.
of things.
Absolutely.
There's something he still clearly so values and realizes as important. It's a key part of his message to involve yourself in the participation of understanding.
Yeah, I feel that really strongly. And, as I've become more associated with the whole kind of meta space in general, whether it's metamodernism or integral, and now folks reach out to me that are just doing some kind of weird, crazy meta thing, not too irregularly, and they want me to look at their really abstract theory about systems and systems of systems and how they all intersect and make sense of the other systems. And it's like, for me, so much of that is useful insofar as it points you back to your life, right? Like, so much of that, I think, is masturbatory. Feels that way to me. Not all of it, of course. I love
Mm-hmm.
it. I engage in it. It's really
Yeah,
great.
me too.
But, oh man, like,
I think it's an example of the lack. It can be so difficult to engage in conversation about some of these things. and perhaps something we share is that we both started a podcast in part, I think, to have conversations, to be involved in it, right?
But I think, like, as you say, this word, this idea of participation, for me, like, it kind of cuts through all of the abstractions. So, in a way, I think it is the central call and invitation of all of these conversations, at least that I've been having, is to be like, look, you are alive. This is your chance. What you do matters. Participate in your life, participate in the world. Like, that is it, right? Because there's so much of our system that is hell-bent on making us forget that we are participants. They want us to think that we're consumers or voters or something else. We are participants here on this world, and we can make a sacred world, or we can live in a flat world, or we can live in a materialist world. We get to participate in that in any case. So I love that you say that. I think it's so central. I think John Vervaeke nails it in that way. Like, that is it. That's the core of the core of the core of the core.
Yes. Yeah, that's beautiful, Daniel. Yeah, I really appreciate your expression of that. I recall, and I can't say this is a direct quote just because my mind is not good at remembering direct quotes, but something John said once: the participation in the self-transcending transformation of the question. And to do this, and to participate, of course, invokes a notion of relationship, invokes this notion of being in a collective where the participation of everyone is valued, and it's transforming what's relevant in community where the individual is valued. This is what we have to do. What I want to, well, actually, that brings us right to the end here. But what I want to ask you, just in closing, and this is something I, depending on how the answer is, something I could clip and maybe put at the beginning, just because I want to offer you the opportunity to direct people to maybe particular episodes that you've published that you think are really interesting for people to engage with. I'm conscious that the conversations I have are often assuming quite a bit of understanding, and that can make it, I think, difficult for people who aren't, exposed to any of this stuff to necessarily be involved. And I find that some of the podcasts you've released have got some really, for example, and I'm just going to say it, the Daniel Schmachtenberger one, I think I've recommended this to loads of people as just an excellent example of some of the important bedrock articulations of his understanding of things that speak to what is emerging as resonant to discuss. So what would you direct people to in specifically your own podcast?
Sure. So I would say, I would listen to the episode I did with Ronan Harrington. I think that's a really good introduction to what we might call like the Nordic brand of metamodernism. And then, I would direct people to the Daniel Schmachtenberger, which would be the perhaps California flavor of metamodernism. And then, honestly, like, because there's this other thing that we've talked about, like about soul, that I don't think either of those conversations really speak to, but a conversation like with Darren Silver, which was earlier on in my catalog, I think would give that flavor, and is a beautiful, one of my favorite conversations, really beautiful. And so, I guess that would be what comes to mind.
Beautiful. Well, Daniel, perhaps just stick around for just 1 minute with me after this, but thank you so much for showing up and doing what you're doing.
Total pleasure. I really enjoyed this exploration.
Whether you're watching on YouTube or listening as a podcast, remember to subscribe and hit the bell to track upcoming releases. Much love.